All right, let's get right into it. What makes someone Native American? Now, on the surface, that question seems pretty simple, right? But the real answer, well, it's complex, it's deeply personal, and it's tangled up in centuries of history, culture, and law.
So first things first, let's just do a little mental exercise. What picture comes to your mind? For a lot of us, it's probably an image shaped by old movies and, let's be honest, stereotypes. Maybe you're picturing someone with darker skin, long hair, maybe riding a horse. But that image, it's just a tiny and often really inaccurate piece of a much bigger story.
The reality today is that Native Americans are modern people, and they look as diverse as any other group of people. You absolutely cannot tell if someone is Native just by looking at them. They rock buzz cuts and braids, they wear suits to the office, and beautiful traditional jingle dresses to powwows. You know, you could have an Ojibwe mom and a British dad, and he might pass on his blonde hair and pale skin. That old monolithic stereotype just completely falls apart when you look at the real world.
So, to really unpack all of this, here's our game plan. First, we're going to tear down that myth of a single native culture. Then, we'll dive into how colonization tried to disrupt the core parts of that identity. After that, we'll look at the really complex ways membership is defined today. And we'll wrap it all up with the powerful theme of perseverance and reclamation.
Okay, first up, beyond the monolith myth. This is so crucial to understand. Long before the United States was even a thought, this land, which many indigenous peoples call Turtle Island, wasn't just one empty space. It was a continent absolutely teeming with hundreds of unique nations.
I mean, each of these tribes had its own totally distinct identity. We're talking completely different spiritual beliefs, unique languages, customs, foods, traditions, the whole shebang. You wouldn't confuse a Kwakwa potlatch with a Muskogee green corn ceremony. That'd be like showing up to Cinco de Mayo in Lederhosen. It just doesn't fit, right? Because they are entirely different cultures.
And that vibrant, incredibly diverse world was profoundly interrupted. So let's move into our next section, culture under colonization. This is really a story of how the very foundations of Native identity, things like spirituality, language, and community, were systematically targeted.
Before colonization, spiritual practices were all over the map, but a lot of them shared this core idea that all living things are related, that we're all part of one big family. But when European colonists showed up, they brought a totally different worldview. They tended to see Native Americans not as people with their own valid ancient beliefs, but as souls that needed to be saved.
For example, take this Puritan guy in New England named John Eliot. He actually learned the Algonquin language specifically so he could convert people to Christianity. And those who did convert were then isolated from their own communities, in these places called praying towns. They were forced to cut their hair, change how they dressed, and abandon their own cultural practices, which, as you can imagine, created these massive, painful rifts within families and entire tribes.
And the legacy of that disruption is still very much alive today. About 2/3 of Native Americans actually identify as Christian. But, and this is the key part, so many people blend traditions. You might meet a grandmother who speaks fluent Navajo and goes to Catholic Mass every single week. Or you might find a church where the pastor burns sweetgrass instead of incense, and a traditional drum has replaced the organ. It's an amazing testament to adaptation and survival.
Now let's talk about another cornerstone of culture that came under attack, language. It's so much more than just words, you know? It's a vessel for tradition, for history. It's a completely unique way of seeing the world.
And tragically, so many of these languages were lost. Just think about the Wampanoag language. After centuries of colonization and assimilation policies, like those government boarding schools where kids were forbidden from speaking their own languages, Wampanoag hadn't been spoken since the late 1800s. An entire world of expression just went silent.
But the story of its return, wow, it begins in the most incredible way. Back in the 1990s, a Wampanoag tribal member named Jessie Little Doe Baird started having these really vivid dreams. And in those dreams, her ancestors were speaking to her in a language she couldn't understand, but one she felt deep down that she knew. She took these dreams as a sign. And get this, there was actually a tribal prophecy that had foretold the language would disappear and then, one day, return. So Jessie went on this incredible mission. She studied linguistics at MIT, she pored over all these historical documents, even a Bible translated by that same John Eliot, to piece the language back together. From all these scraps, she built a 10,000-word dictionary and started teaching classes. And her daughter became the first native Wampanoag speaker in 7 generations. Just amazing. The story of reclamation is just so powerful, but identity today is also shaped by a very different force: bureaucracy. And this brings us to our next section, defining membership today, and this big shift from a purely cultural identity to a legal one.
See, before colonization, tribes themselves determined who belonged. It was often based on who you were related to, sure, but also through things like adoption or marriage. It was about community. But over the years, the U.S. government started imposing new standards, and that fundamentally changed how many tribes define who's in and who's out.
One of the biggest tools used for this was something called the Dawes Rolls. These were basically lists that the U.S. government created in the late 1800s and early 1900s to document members of 5 specific tribes. And today, to be an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation, for instance, you must be able to trace the direct ancestor back to those specific lists.
In other tribes, the most common method is something called blood quantum. I know, it sounds like something out of a sci-fi thriller, but it's really a fraction of tribal blood that a person has to have to enroll. For example, the Navajo Nation requires a person to have at least 1/4 Navajo blood to be accepted as a member.
And this isn't some rare thing. We're talking about 70%, 7-0, of all federally recognized tribes in the U.S. using some form of blood quantum for enrollment. It's a widespread legacy from a very particular historical moment.
Okay, so this is where it gets really complicated, because this is a huge debate within Native communities themselves. On one hand, many argue it's a colonial tool that was designed to eventually erase Native people through intermarriage, that it treats identity like a math problem and risks future generations not even qualifying for membership. On the other hand, some argue it's the best way to prove a direct lineage, to preserve close-knit communities, and to protect tribal sovereignty. There is just no easy answer here.
And this brings up a super common question. Hey, what about DNA tests? Can they prove you're Native American? The answer is a clear and simple no. At most, a test might show you related to a tribal member somewhere down the line, but there is no specific genetic marker for being Navajo or Cherokee or any other tribe. Tribal identity is about citizenship and community, not just genetics.
To make things even more complex, you have this whole other layer of federal recognition. Right now, the U.S. government officially recognizes 574 tribes, and this status is absolutely vital because federal benefits like healthcare and education and a lot of the legal protections for sacred sites only apply to members of these recognized tribes. If your tribe isn't on that list, you're facing a much steeper climb.
So we've looked at culture, spirituality, language, and the law. And that brings us to our final section, perseverance and reclamation. Because if there's one single thread that runs through all of these different experiences and stories, it's this.
This quote really just says it all. Ever since colonists first arrived, there have been these constant efforts to dilute, to restrain, and to destroy Native cultures, from creating categories to define people, to separating them from their lands and their languages. But through it all, Native people have persevered. And in that perseverance, they've begun to reclaim what was taken away.
So maybe the better question isn't just what makes someone Native American, but a much more profound one. After everything, what does it truly mean to be a people who are, against all odds, still here? And that is a powerful thought to end on.